Hey, APUSH gang. Good to see you guys, sort of. And I am happy to report that we're almost done. Hopefully you guys are spending some time outside of these interactions to prepare for your AP exam. So as we jump into today's lesson, I'm going to be covering chapter 21 in one sit down. Had to read a lot about the government and the New Deal, and a lot of it I already knew, but trying to put it in a format that will help you guys was a little bit challenging. So the book didn't make it very easy, but just in reflection where we're coming from, the Herbert Hoover administration and the Great Depression, 3 or 4 years of awful in the United States, a continuing downturn of the economy, more and more people losing their jobs. By the time that Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, as he liked to be called, became president, the unemployment rate in the United States was 25%. The farming sector was pretty much collapsed. I think I read that 5,000 banks in the United States had closed their doors. Your book actually says that many states had no functioning banks, which essentially meant people had no way to retrieve their money that they had put in banks. Many of them lost the money. People were hiding their money inside their mattresses. And so FDR came onto the scene in a really, really bad situation. Now, in Herbert Hoover's defense, many of the trials and tribulations that he encountered as president were way outside of his control. The farming sector had been in terrible shape for a very long time. Americans were living on credit, as they do today. Of course, the stock market crash was a result of bad banking policy, bad stock market policy. A lot of the movers and shakers, the business creators, lost everything in the stock market crash. And then all of that underneath the umbrella of a worldwide, pretty much depression. As a result of World War I. And so when you have all of these markets that are connected, consumer markets connected, and one large country suffers economic downturn, it inevitably affects other markets. And so America had kind of we had been able to kind of stay above that curve initially following World War I, but it ultimately caught up with us. And so as I mentioned in the previous lesson, Hoover was your classic conservative Republican laissez-faire, hands off the economy, so his inability to fix the situation was an image, or it was thrown onto the Republicans, onto that conservative, pro-market, pro-capitalism ideology, and so a lot of Americans believed it was the fault of that economic system, or there was the perception, and that they were looking for something new. And they certainly found something new in Franklin Roosevelt. And as I said before, I'll probably generally refer to him as FDR, since that is what he preferred to be called. He was a lifelong politician. He was the fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a articulate man, had a way with words, used the radio and his fireside chats to encourage and lift up Americans. He actually was a budget hawk, or he was against deficit spending, and so he believed that the federal government should balance their budgets. Now, that is not the Democrat Party of today, but at the time, given the circumstances, he was a deficit hawk, as they like to call him. So he was not in favor of spending a lot of money to get us out of the recovery, but he did believe that the federal government could get involved in regulations and other things of business to stimulate the economy. In fact, one of his criticisms of Hoover was that Hoover did too much spending, too much deficit spending, which is ironic, because Hoover didn't want to do deficit spending, but found himself creating opportunities like the Hoover Dam, or the Boulder Dam as it was called then, to provide jobs, which is certainly something that Franklin Roosevelt is about to do. So with that said, hopefully you enjoyed your Heimler's history videos. I'll be looking to make sure that you guys review the packet of information that I forwarded to you, and I saw that Mrs. Bowers also forwarded to you, that sort of gives the instructions for your AP exam on Friday. And what else? There was some, there's There's an exam day checklist that you're supposed to go through and make sure you have everything as well. Also in that booklet, it goes into some detail about what you can and cannot use for your AP exam. I have not found anywhere that says you may not use the internet, but it says you could be in violation if you use the internet for looking for research. So I'm going to try to nail that down. They discourage that because you could spend a lot of wasted time perusing the internet for information on something, and then you don't get finished with your essay. So I'll follow up with that, but they do definitely tell you what you should have available to you: your book, your notes. I believe they said you could use notes that you have on your computer. So anyway, okay, so I'm going to jump into chapter 21, period 7, the New Deal. In this period of time that this chapter covers is from 1932 to 1940. There were two phases of the New Deal, the first New Deal and the second New Deal. Most of them took place within the first year, and then in the first part of his administration. He continued to kind of tinker with things, trying to figure out what worked and what didn't work. In fact, FDR famously said, well, if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. So it wasn't that he was necessarily set on the things that ideas that he introduced. In fact, he enjoyed bringing in lots of people with differing views. They said that his style was really interesting. If you were to walk into the Oval Office when he was meeting with his advisors, you would hear them yelling at each other and screaming at each other, and he would just be taking it all in. And then he would ask, well, what do you think, to somebody who had a completely different viewpoint. And so he listened to everybody's advice, and then once he felt comfortable with something, he plowed forward. And so his style was real interesting. And like I said, if something didn't work, he didn't throw a temper tantrum generally. He just said, this didn't work, let's try something different. And of course, the circumstances were very unusual that he found himself. So I'm going to read, there were several sections in this chapter that I felt are important to draw to your attention, since I'm not having you actually read it. But there are certain profound statements, I'll call it that Mr. Foner brings out in his writing that personify this era, and so I'm going to read some of those to you. I have them in the PowerPoint. The first one that I've brought to your attention is on page 809. It says, taken together, the first New Deal was a series of experiments, some of which succeeded and some of which did not. They transformed the role of the federal government, constructed numerous public facilities, and provided relief to millions of needy persons. But they did not end the Depression. Some 10 million Americans, more than 20% of the workforce, remained unemployed when 1934 came to an end. He goes on to say earlier in the chapter, this is, again, I found very interesting, because as you study history, political parties take on different ideas throughout the course of time and adapt. There we go. They adapt to their surroundings and the situation on the ground. And so what might have been construed as a Democrat in 1850 is not necessarily the Democratic Party of today. Oftentimes we Republicans, although I don't always vote Republican, I generally do, Republicans identify as the party of Lincoln. And sadly, in the 1930s, the Republican Party became associated with the Ku Klux Klan. You're going to see another shift in word or expressions or descriptions of these political ideals. Now, if I were to say today, something is liberal, a person is liberal, you would most likely identify them with the Democratic Party and a whole host of other things. If I were to say somebody is conservative, you'd probably identify with Republicans or the Conservative Party. In this era, in the 1920s and 1930s, if somebody described themselves as liberal, that would mean, I'll just read this, liberalism traditionally was understood as the belief in limited government and free market economics. Okay, that is not liberalism today, for sure. Liberalism today means big government overreach. But in 1920 and 1930, if you said you were liberal, it meant that you believed in limited government and free market economics. So that has flipped on a dime. And so the modern definition of liberalism evolves during Roosevelt's era. He comes to signify liberalism. So again, I'll read this to you. Liberalism, traditionally understood as limited government and free market economics, took on a modern meaning thanks to the New Deal. It now referred to active efforts by the national government to modernize and regulate the market economy and to uplift less fortunate members of society. Okay, so the New Deal was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's plan to get our economy out of the pits, out of the Depression. And FDR took a three-prong approach. And so they oftentimes historians refer to the 3 R's of the New Deal. And so when Roosevelt was campaigning for the presidency, he said, I have a new deal for America. If you remember, his cousin Teddy would say, Americans deserve a square deal. Okay, so same kind of play on words. Roosevelt, FDR wanted Americans to look beyond Hoover and the Depression and optimistically say, I have a new deal for you. We're going to turn the page on this Depression, and I've got some ideas that we're going to try. And so that's what the New Deal was. It was a package of government solutions to the Depression, and they came in the packaging of relief, initial relief, recovery, and reform. And so those are the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. So some elements of the New Deal were immediate relief to people who were desperately needing help. Some parts of the New Deal involved a recovery program, how to get us over the hump. And then the third part of it, reform, had to do with long-term permanent programs that would change the way we do business, and it would change the government's relationship to business and to its citizenry. So we're going to go through those a little bit. So the 3 R's, relief, recovery, reform. All right, so just real quickly, the presidential campaign of 1922, you'll see a picture of President Hoover and President Roosevelt sitting in a car together on their way to the inauguration. And I don't remember where I read this, if it was in your book or online, but apparently the two men were not fans of one another. They barely spoke to each other on the way to the inauguration. Hoover looks a little bit disgusted. Of course, he's lost the election. And the article that I saw, or the picture that I saw, says the two men never spoke again. Hoover went on to do basically humanitarian work in the remainder of his life. And so so this campaign, this presidential campaign of 1932, I said 22, I need to change that on here. FDR will become president in 1933. The election takes place in 1932. Had 2 very stark different candidates. Of course, the era of Republicans was coming to an end, and this new Democrat, very well-seasoned politician, had a message of hope. So Hoover's laissez-faire, hands-off government, hands-off policy had not secured America from the Depression. So that was obvious. FDR promised a new deal for the American people. Another part of the campaign, which is interesting, is that if you were to hear these 2 men on the stump, their messages seemed very similar. We're going to get you out of the Depression. We're going to limit government spending, etc., etc. However, the Democrat policy called for a repeal of prohibition, and I'm sure that was in large part because they wanted the tax revenue. So that was a major difference on their 2 platforms. So the Democrats were calling for a repeal of prohibition. And as I mentioned before, Democrats charged the Republicans with too much deficit spending, which is ironic. And also something else that the book makes an observation about, kind of just in passing, is that because we were so consumed with the Depression, that Americans became significant isolationists during this period as it was related to foreign policy. Lots of bad things were happening in Europe, and actually when Franklin Roosevelt became president, that's the same year that Adolf Hitler started to come to power in Germany. Benito Mussolini was already in power. Spain was, I think at that point, engulfed in a civil war. The Bolsheviks, or the communists of Russia, had established a brutal totalitarian reign under Joseph Stalin and his 5-year programs that were killing millions of people, starving them to death. So things were bad enough at home. They didn't want to pay any attention to what was happening abroad. They'd done their job with the doughboys in World War One, and so Americans stuck their head in the sand. So that was also a significant part of what was happening in this presidential campaign. The book spends a lot of time talking about what's known as the first 100 days. As you can imagine, that refers to President Roosevelt, FDR's first 100 days in office. Since this time, presidents are often held under a microscope, as is related to their first 100 days in office. What are they going to get accomplished? Poor President Trump, as you guys probably know since you lived during this era, although you were 3 years younger, he was shot in the foot right out of the gate, being accused of Russian collusion and being essentially having a special counsel called to investigate his campaign. He also got shot in the foot because Republicans all during President Obama's administration said they wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare, which is government health care, the law that was passed, and the Affordable Care Act. And once they actually got to vote on it and it counted, suddenly Republicans weren't so crazy and gung-ho about repealing and replacing Obamacare. And it really embarrassed President Trump because he thought that was their number one priority. So his first 100 days in office were awful. And if they were a sign of things to come, people were like, oh, it's going to be a rough presidency. So, and of course now he's dealing with the epidemic or the pandemic. So the first 100 days is kind of iconically started with the FDR presidency. So let me kind of just go through my points here. I mentioned this before. The book calls it "There's no blueprint." We don't know. Nobody knows how to fix this economic problem. There were standard economic beliefs about what worked and what didn't. What the Republicans had applied to the situation had not worked. And so there was no blueprint, and Roosevelt was willing to try a whole bunch of stuff. On page 802, a quote says, Roosevelt conceived of the New Deal as an alternative to socialism on the left, Nazism on the right, and then the Republican idea of complete inaction and holding up the unregulated capitalist system. That's how he perceived Republicans. And so he was trying to find the middle ground, something not too far left, something not too far right, but something that would immediately help people and be able to get their hands on this problem. One of his most significant influences was a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, and you probably do need to know his name and know who he is. He basically becomes the architect of what becomes known as Keynesian economics, which is based upon his name, Keynes. And essentially, laissez-faire economics believed that if the government would unregulate and get out of the business of trying to be business makers, that broken markets, supply and demand curves, would fix themselves. If there's too much supply in the market, it will get so cheap and that it won't be worth making anymore, or reduction will slow down to meet the demand, and vice versa. If there's too much demand for something and not enough product, the industrial sector will create more product to meet the demand. And so that is kind of a laissez-faire free market system. And Keynes was like, you know what? Sometimes the markets are not very intuitive and people suffer as a result of this. And you have prices that are abnormally high so that the everyday blue-collar worker can't afford them. And you create a class system. So sometimes it's okay to help regulate those markets, to provide competition and make sure that the prices don't get too high, and that there is enough demand or enough supply in the system to meet everybody's needs. And so he was a huge advocate of government reaching into those freely operating markets and manipulating them to get the desired outcome, which is the best price for the most number of people, so that prosperity can be evenly distributed through the markets, not controlled by the government, but through the markets. And so he's not a communist, but he's not a free market capitalist either. And so that was sort of the philosophy that eventually FDR ended up kind of going with. So he's a pretty significant. Also, in those first few days of his administration, he appointed to his cabinet a number of people with varying views. Some of them were free market, some of them were not. But he also sought out academia, college professors, Columbia University professors who taught economics, and asked their opinion. And they tended to move him in the direction of Keynesian economics. And they were known as the Brain Trust. And again, super important keyword you need to know. The Brain Trust was Roosevelt's advisors who were not part of the political system, but that were college professors, wrote books, were economists, etc., that advised him. The Brain Trust generally argued that the competitive marketplace was the thing of the past. Large firms needed to be managed and directed by the government, but not dismantled. And their view prevailed. So he begins with a program of diving in and regulating the economy and regulating business. So going back to those relief, recovery, reform, I'm going to just read my definitions for that. Relief is the immediate action taken to halt the economic deterioration. Recovery programs were designed, they were temporary programs to restart the flow of consumer demand. And reform plans were permanent programs to avoid another depression down the road and to make sure that citizens had, that their fear of future economic disaster was alleviated. There's a political cartoon on there that you can take a look at that associates relief, recovery, and reform. Okay, so let's look at the first 100 days of his presidency. Let's look at those things that were immediate objects of relief that he employed as part of his New Deal. First thing he did was he looked at the banking system, was like, okay, he called for an emergency session of Congress and said, we've got to legislate some things here to help the banking system immediately. He also wanted to ensure people's to increase people's confidence in those same banking systems, because he needed people to put their money back in the banks so that the banks, which are historically a huge arm of investment in the community, would have money to invest again. People were scared to death to put their money in the bank. So he initially called for a bank holiday, shut the banks down, every bank. And I can't remember how long that lasted. I should have looked that up. But however long it lasted, that was to stop people from withdrawing money from the banks and to give Congress time to pass some legislation that would secure and prop up those banks. By, let's see, March of I already mentioned this, by March of 1933, banking had been suspended in a majority of states because of the Depression. And so the law that Congress passed during that emergency session was called the Emergency Banking Act. This is important. And essentially what they did was they sent people into all of the banks that were still operating to determine whether they were solvent or unsolvent. Basically, did they have money or did they not have money? Were they just propped up for a period of time and they're going to ultimately collapse? Which was it? And so if they were insolvent, they closed those banks because they didn't want investors or people putting their money into those banks and then more people lose their money. And then those banks that they felt were solvent, they poured money into them to make sure that they did not fail. They also passed the Federal Emergency Relief Act. Okay, so let me say that again. It's called the FERA. You'll see all these initials, the Federal Emergency Relief Act. And essentially, FDR was not a proponent of welfare. He did not believe that you should just give people money to help them buy groceries until the next paycheck and give them more money. He believed people needed incentive, and that by just handing out money to people, that you would break their spirit and defeat them. And then you'd also potentially, people would become dependent on the government and they wouldn't go out and try to find work. And so rather than just doing handouts, he wanted to provide jobs for people. Unfortunately, there were people that were just in dire situations, that were, single moms or had dependent children who were unable to work or were in such desperate situations. They were living in cardboard boxes or living in their cars that they couldn't operate because they couldn't put gas in them. And so this Federal Emergency Relief Act distributed money to local municipalities for them to manage, and said, when somebody is in this, you determine it, but you determine how these resources are used, but make sure that they go to the most desperate. And so it was just kind of like what our Congress recently did with the COVID crisis. They essentially poured billions of dollars into an account that was distributed to banks that can give either loans to small businesses that are either temporary or don't have to be paid back if they continue to hire people, and all kinds of things. So temporary fixes for the next 6 weeks that are meant to continue to put money into people's pockets, but encourage them to go back to work when the quarantine lifts. Probably the most significant part of the immediate relief packet was, rather than handing out money, was the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as CCC. 3 million young men were given jobs that went out into the community. They did a whole host of things, but what they're probably most famous for are all of those state parks and national parks all around the country that they either built, or they shored up, or they cleaned, or they deforested. They only made $30 a month. They lived in kind of like a dorm room type of situations. Devil's Den was actually built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it was primarily directed to young, unemployed men. And so they would have their food and their boarding paid for, and they could send $30 home a month to help. But it also gave them something to do that wasn't just a handout, and were the beneficiaries of it because they built a lot of beautiful state parks all around the country. So that was immediate relief for Americans. Okay, so the recovery part. So you have a relief, recovery, reform. So a recovery, pieces of legislation that were passed in the first 100 days. By the way, I didn't mention this before, but there were 15 major laws passed during the first 100 days that are part of that first 100 days, the first New Deal. Some of them lasted, some of them didn't, some of them worked, some of them didn't, but there were 15 of them. So the recovery portion of the first 100 days, the centerpiece of FDR's first 100 days, first New Deal program was a law called the National Industrial Recovery Act. And this was the big government grab of business and regulating business to try to manipulate the markets in such a way that supply and demand meet. And so it was known as the NIRA. And I'm going to read this. So it was the centerpiece of Roosevelt's recovery program combating the Depression. It was modeled on the World War I War Industries Board. It established the National Recovery Administration, which would work with business leaders to establish industry codes that set standards for output of private industry, prices that they could charge in private industry, and working conditions, salaries paid to employees, etc. Effectively, this ended competition in the marketplace because those same rules and regulations were applied to similar industries across the board. So it was a huge government grab of private industry to try to fix the markets. It's the logo for the NRA was a blue eagle. It's kind of, to me, reminiscent of Nazi Germany with the eagle and whatnot. But anyway, you'll see a picture of it there. So that was a huge, huge overreach of the federal government to regulate private business. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was also part of the recovery program, and it authorized the federal government to set up production quotas for farmers. It even paid them not to grow things. Apparently the price of pork was so low that farmers were raising pigs. It was costing them more to sustain the pigs than to if they weren't even raising pigs. And so I think the book says that sometime during this era the government ordered farmers to kill 6 million pigs, just kill them, slaughter them, and discard of the food. And so the food wasn't even given to the soup kitchens and all of that. They would just get rid of the pigs, because if we get rid of the supply, the price of food will rise, which it did, but it had a short-term effect. So that's the AAA. And then again, another huge one that you have to know is the Tennessee Valley Authority was established. Parts of the South were in just utter economic poverty. They continued to live backwards. Tennessee, the mountains around Tennessee. The people were illiterate, they were poor, they did not have available electricity. They just lived like backwood, I don't know what, country bumpkins. They may have wanted to live that way, but the federal government wanted to go in and rescue them. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority was essentially the government putting people to work to make they made all kinds of dams along several of the river systems there, to produce hydroelectric power so that they could bring electricity to these parts of the country that didn't have it. So it provided jobs and also provided technology to the poorest among us. I believe the Tennessee Valley Authority is still in effect. The government still runs that electric grid down there. It says this was the first time government was in the business of selling electricity in competition with private companies. And you see that a lot in socialist countries. And so, and I believe it's still in effect today. There's a picture there of it. Some of the dams they built. Okay, then moving beyond the 100 days, some of those things worked, some of them didn't. But moving beyond the first 100 days, the recovery program continued. This is sometimes referred to as the second New Deal. And so FDR evaluated what they had done. And he said, okay, this worked, this didn't work. Let's not do this. Let's go ahead and try. Let's change this a little bit. And so the recovery again which was to move people beyond the immediate crisis. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, was introduced. And again, going back to Roosevelt not wanting to just hand out money, the Works Progress Administration created jobs for a whole segment of the country: white collar workers, artists, writers, photographers, and I'll list some of the things that it says that the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, changed the physical face of America by hiring 3 million Americans government jobs. And so they were paid by the government to do these things. And these are some of the things they did. They constructed public buildings and bridges. They built over 500,000 miles of road. They built 600 airports. They hired white-collar workers such as doctors and dentists to go into poor communities. And so they weren't working pro bono. They were getting a federal check, but they were doing medical work within certain communities that couldn't afford it. FDR hired a whole host of writers, historical writers, and photographers that went into the 48 states and went county by county interviewing people, talking about the history of their families. One of the groups that they targeted was he wanted to interview as many former slaves as he could while they were still alive. And so they have all of this historical written documents about testimonies of former slaves. That very, very famous picture from the Depression of the woman and her children in a looks like a cardboard house on their way to California. It's the most famous picture of the Great Depression, was actually photographed by a woman who worked for the WPA as part of her job. Let's see what else. Federal dance projects were introduced, federal ballets and orchestras. They even came up with this thing called the National Youth Association, which was supposed to help teenagers who couldn't find work, encourage them, give them something to do. So that the Workers' Progress Administration, the WPA, was all part of this recovery program in the second New Deal. And then a huge part of the second New Deal was something called the Wagner Act. And that's actually going to be part of your assignment for Wednesday. But I want you to do a little research on the Wagner Act. It was very controversial at the time. FDR was a huge pro-union guy, pro-workers guy, and wanted to encourage them to organize. And the Wagner Act allowed the National Labor Board, Union Labor Board, to oversee elections within workplaces who were voting whether or not they wanted to be unionized or not be unionized. And so it really gave a huge amount of power to organized labor. Let's see here, what else? So now we're moving on to reform. So that was recovery. Reform took place mostly in the second New Deal, beyond the first 100 days. A real important law that was passed is called the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act Prevented, and this is, I think, I think the Glass-Steagall Act was basically expired in 1990 or 1991. But it barred barred commercial banks from becoming involved in buying and selling of stocks. So this was part of reforming the banking system. The Glass-Steagall Act also put into place something that is still in effect: the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which insures your bank deposits and my bank deposits. I think today it's 150,000. I need to look at that. That your money is insured by the federal government within your bank for up to $150,000. So if the bank were to collapse, if Arvest just shut its doors and said, we don't have any money, the federal government would write you a check for the amount of money that you had in your bank account, which again encouraged people to deposit money into their banks. What else was I going to say about that? People who are extremely wealthy will oftentimes diversify their funds so that all of their money, if it's in a bank, is insured. So if they are a multimillionaire, they may have a certain amount of money in this bank, a certain amount of money in that bank to make sure that it's all insured. But most often, very wealthy people will also invest their money in a variety of other things to protect it. The Security and Exchange Commission was a permanent agency set up to monitor the stock market activity and to ensure that no fraud or insider trading was taking place. That had to be put into effect. The stock market collapsed because a lot of these things were not put into place, and there was a lot of fraud. The most significant long-term impact was the development of the Social Security Administration. We think of Social Security as old age retirement money. And if you look at the word Social Security, the idea was security, economic security, basically. Going back to the theme of freedom and liberty. Our social systems did not feel secure in the aftermath of the Depression. People lost everything. They didn't know how they were going to take care of themselves in their old age. And so the Social Security Administration pushed forward the idea of a Social Security law that would require people, individuals, and the businesses that they work for to withdraw money from their paychecks and put it in a savings account so that when they become of a certain age, they will have been forced essentially to save for retirement. Part of that withdrawal also goes into an unemployment account. So if you lose your job, if your dad or mom loses their job and they've been working for years, a percentage of their paycheck every time that they're paid goes into an unemployment fund. Their employer also pays a percentage of it. And so if they lose their job, they can draw on that unemployment fund. Now, in effect, the government controls the fund and they probably spent it all, but they keep track of how much money you've contributed, how much your employer has contributed. In theory, they use that to pay you unemployment money or insurance while you are looking for a job. Social Security, unfortunately, was in a lockbox. It was supposed to be, I think it goes through the Federal Reserve, but I'm not 100% sure. But for 20 or 30 years, all of those withdrawals from people's individual paychecks and their employers' contributions was kept in a safe box. I'll call it that for lack of a better word, where the government could not draw upon that money for any reason whatsoever. Unfortunately, during the Vietnam era, Lyndon Johnson convinced Congress to allow the government to use that money as an investment since it was just sitting there. And so that fund is running out and eventually will completely run out. And so when you retire and when I retire, the government will have to write the check straight out of the government's tax collection. And it'll be real difficult for them to do. So they've got to fix that, and they refuse to fix it because it means it's political suicide. You can't tell old people that you're going to change the system. It freaks them out. So, but anyway, that was invented in the aftermath of during the Great Depression, to try to give people economic security. So again, look at that word, Social Security. It also provided aid to disabled, elderly, poor, and dependent children. So if you had a handicapped child, you couldn't go to work because you provided for them, or you had to take care of them. This would also give you some resources and funds. Okay. Whew, this is boring stuff, I know. All right, I'm going to read a couple more things from the book. Page 818, the end of this section about the New Deal. It says Social Security represented a dramatic departure from the traditional functions of government. The second New Deal transformed the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. Before the 1930s, national political debate often revolved around the question of whether the federal government should intervene in the economy. After the New Deal, debate rested on how much it should intervene. In addition, the government assumed a responsibility which it had never In addition, the government assumed a responsibility which it has never wholly relinquished for guaranteeing Americans a living wage and protecting them against economic and personal misfortune. We are smack dab in the middle of this with the coronavirus crisis. The government, our Congress, has given the Federal Reserve permission to print money, and Congress has given authorization to spend, I think at this point it's $3.5 trillion to send checks out in the mail to secure people's economic security, make sure that they have money to pay their bills, to continue to spend money. It's about spending money. The reason our economy is faltering right now is because people are not spending money like they normally would. And our businesses and our industry are shrinking as a result of that. And people are losing their jobs as a result of that. And when people lose their jobs, they don't have money to spend. And when they don't have money to spend, more of the economy shrinks. So this lifeline that's been thrown to us, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but this temporary lifeline that has been thrown to Americans is so that they will keep spending money, that they won't have to file for unemployment. But if they do have to file for unemployment, they're putting money in those accounts as well. And it's so that they will keep spending money because we are a consumer society. And if our consumers are spending money, our economy is roaring. If we are not spending money, our economy shrinks. And then finally, this in the same section, in yellow, you'll see it says, laissez-faire is dead, wrote Walter Lippmann. The modern state has become responsible for the modern economy and the task of ensuring the standard of life for its people. And so government is no longer primarily responsible for defending America from an outside attack and is securing people's civil liberties. America's government is now responsible for ensuring the economic freedom of the American citizen. So it's taken on a whole nother responsibility, and it will either sink or swim. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. Last few thoughts. There's this chapter just kind of goes all over the place, in addition to the stuff on the New Deal. But I think it's important that you understand that the Supreme Court of the 1930s was primarily Republican and conservative. They continued to support the idea of liberty of contract. And so they viewed FDR's New Deal programs as a huge overreach of the government and completely unconstitutional. And so the 1935 court threw out a whole bunch of those programs. Just completely ruled them unconstitutional. And for this reason, the court declared that federal regulation of codes and other regulations within industry was a power of the legislature, not the executive branch. He didn't have the authority to write laws like that. Because much of what was being enacted was Congress was passing a law and then letting the executive branch regulate. And the court also said that the executive branch did not have the authority to regulate commerce that was not interstate commerce. So you can't just reach into a chicken farm in Arkansas and try to regulate it if those chickens are not being sold across state lines. The Constitution is pretty clear about that. So FDR was furious, absolutely furious, that the Supreme Court would resist him that way. So he began to concoct a plan to change the makeup of the court. And so many of the justices on the court were over 70 years of age. I think it was 70. And so he encouraged Congress to pass a law that would allow whoever the president was to add a justice to the Supreme Court for every person on the court who was over 70 years of age, because he said when you're that old, you are out of touch, out of step with what's happening in the world today, and that we need fresh eyes, fresh minds on the court. And so, and then that would also encourage justices who were really, really old to step aside and let new people come to the power. So effectively what that would have done at the time, it would have increased the court from 9 to, I think he was going to add 6 to 15. So 15 justices. And so he wanted, because there were 6 of them that were over 70. So they would have gone from 9 to 15. And of course that would have given him a huge advantage. He could appoint people to the court that were in step with him. And this was called court packing, or packing the Supreme Court. Congress, the Senate stood up to him and said, no, we're not going to let you do that. But he still achieved what he wanted, because it really, really, really rattled the Supreme Court. And so they became much less inclined to resist his reform legislation that he was kind of behind. And then some of them began to retire. And by the time he leaves office, the Supreme Court has a completely different demeanor, and they've began to let go of that old idea of liberty of contract. Let's see here. I think I've got one more slide about that. Okay, so Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in FDR's second term was Chief Justice Charles Evans, and he announced a new judicial definition of freedom because he said the words freedom of contract do not appear in the Constitution. He said, quote, liberty required the protection of law against the evils which menace the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people. And so they began to support him. All right, there's a section of the book about labor's great upheaval, and because FDR was, well, how shall I say this? So FDR was real pro-union, and so he made a lot of the changes that the Republicans had put into place in the Great Depression. But because of the Depression, industry leaders, manufacturing owners became very emboldened, because when you have limited number of jobs and a lot of people that want to fill them, you get to set the rules. It's different when you can't find enough people to hire. If you can't fill your jobs, you're willing to do what the job seekers want. And so conditions had become terrible within factories, according to the book. Employees were underpaid. They didn't feel like they had much of a voice because if they got fired, they couldn't find a job. It was, job security was very, very scary during this time. And so when FDR became president and supported labor, a lot of those things began to change. And there's a whole section about the upheaval of labor and strikes and sit-in strikes, the CIO, even labor unions tended to be very discriminatory and select Anglo-Saxon and whatnot, with the exception of the IWW. And during this period of time, you see a lot of inclusion. Of course, immigration had been ceased after World War I, and so you have second generations of immigrants. So immigration and all of those issues related to that within the factories was less of a deal at this time. And so labor was able to organize with the support of the president, and they what they call open shop. They were able to organize because a lot of manufacturing company owners didn't want them organizing because it was a hassle. They had to deal with them, and they didn't want to deal with them, and they had to pay them more, and all of those things. And so unionization effectively grew significantly during this era. I'll have one slide on here that touches on some of the highlights of this upheaval. It was important enough to have a huge section about it in the chapter, so I think we need to be familiar with it, and I will list the organizations and the things that you need to know associated with that. And then finally, Mr. Foner always kind of circles back around and talks about, well, what about the Black American? What about the woman? What about disgruntled Mexican Americans and whatnot? Unfortunately, one of the big problems of the New Deal and this new idea of a welfare state or social security system to protect the most vulnerable excluded agricultural workers and domestic employees. I don't know why, but it did. I guess they figured you'd always have a job if you worked in agriculture, and I'm not sure why it did not include them, but it disproportionately affected Black Americans and specifically Black women. It also disproportionately affected Mexican farm workers that came across the border and worked on some of those Southwest farms. They were unable to attain help in their dire circumstances. Franklin or FDR was not a big civil rights guy either. He did appoint some Black Americans to a variety of positions. His wife Eleanor was much more sympathetic to the situation. Congress was trying to pass a federal anti-lynching law that FDR never really got on board with, and ended up not passing because of Southern Democrats. And so there continued to be just a sluggish attitude towards Black Americans. FDR was not as bad as his cousin Franklin or Teddy Roosevelt, but he was not an advocate either. And then finally, there's just kind of one interesting thing that the book mentions is that between 1930 and 1940, we see a huge historic shift in the Black voting patterns. And so, historically, Black Americans who had the right who had the right to vote voted Republican because it was the party of Lincoln. But as the country grew to the north and to the west, and Blacks were attaining in small ways the right to vote in various places in the north and in the west, especially after the Great Migration, they began to shift their vote from Republican to Democrat, with the perception that they were more in alignment with their plight. And so, and that's where we are today. The perception by most of Black Americans is that the Democratic Party supports them, and so that's kind of where we're at today. Okay, I think that is it. So pay attention to instructions in Google Classroom. I'm going to send you some more Heimler's videos. I'm also going to send you a couple of things associated with the AP exam about writing your thesis and essay writing, that sort of thing. So I'm going to cover one more chapter, World War II, in our lesson on Wednesday, but most of your outside of classroom activities are going to be focused on review, review, review. So I am ready for summer. We're almost there, guys. Hang on. You got 5 days, and then we will be home free. So anyway, see y'all. Bye.